Aloha, and thank you for the chance to present these results from our Maunalua Bay Fishing Community Assessment. It was a very interesting project, and I was very lucky to be involved with such an interesting group of people working on such an important set of issues. Fishing, as we know, changes through time. The gears that people use and the types of fishing that occurs changes through time. But the one thing that's constant is the importance of fishing to local communities, Pacific Islands, where fishing has long been part of the local cultures and communities. The goal for this fishing community assessment was to assess the health of the bay and its fisheries, to characterize the fishing community and their activities in the bay, and to solicit information from the fishing community about recommended actions for the future of the bay in order to ensure that the fishing community had a voice for future planning or management. We've developed a participatory research design that was initiated in 2010, and by that what we mean is the community really led this effort. Malama Maunalua and their partners developed the research tasks and goals and objectives of this. Myself and others really helped in executing it, but really it was the local community that led this. Interviewers were from the local community and from local fishing families. We developed an interviewee training course to standardize data collection. And the methods that we used were a commonly used set of social science methodologies. We identified experienced fishermen through a chain referral or snowball sampling, which means that of the fishermen that we did know in the community, we just asked them to recommend folks that they thought were particularly experienced or knowledgeable and they could tell us a lot about the fisheries in the bay. We purposefully sampled folks that were experienced and knowledgeable. Those are the types of fishing folk that we wanted to get. And we did in-depth face-to-face interviews through the beginning of this year with our interviewee group. As I mentioned, we did an interviewee training course, and the purpose of that was to make sure that everyone was deploying our survey instrument in a consistent way and that we were collecting data in a consistent way. It was a lot of fun. We did some role play, and we had a lot of good times discussing the methodology. And all these folks are from local families and local fishing families, so we really had great entree into the community as a result of that. So let's jump into the results. We interviewed 58 fishers. The average years of experience among these folks was almost 35 years. 5 fishers had 55 plus years of fishing experience in the bay. And what this tells us in a nutshell is that long-time fishers are the folks that we got. These are the folks that are really experienced and knowledgeable about Maunalua Bay and its fisheries resources. Where are people fishing? They're fishing all over the bay. We identified 7 primary areas within the bay between the 2 points of Maunalua, and this just tells us that basically fishing is occurring throughout the bay. Some areas are just geographically larger than others, which is probably explaining part of the trends that we see here, but the take-home message is that people are fishing throughout the bay. And they're fishing different types of habitats. And we asked people when they first started fishing which habitats did they use versus the present day. We identified 5 basic habitat types from the intertidal, the inside reef, the reef edge, the deep reef, and the pelagic zone. All these areas are being used at a high rate from 43 to 77%. But we see a shift from when people first started fishing versus present day. And the major shift is that we see people are spending more time in the offshore and deep reef zones. And there's a couple of reasons that might be occurring. Some of these hypotheses that we had can be explained by our qualitative data. Number one, we could see depletion in the inshore areas, the intertidal, inner reef, and reef edge areas. As things become less abundant there, people could be moving offshore. But what we also can see is that fishing secondarily could be occurring in these offshore areas because people are just getting easier access to boats, or they're getting older, so they're able to buy boats and the types of equipment and gears to access those regions. So it's probably a little bit of both that are occurring. We certainly know that depletion in the nearshore areas is part of the story here, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Fishing activities. The most prevalent gear type were spears, whether 3-prong, sling, or spear guns. But a lot of different gears are being deployed in the bay. That's not surprising. In a multi-species fishery like Maunalua Bay, you get a diversity of gear types. Poles, for example, can be shore fishing. They can be boat-based fishing, trolling. But you also get nets and bottom fishing gears and fly fishing. So we have a diversity of gear types that are being used throughout the bay to exploit these different types of habitats, whether it's intertidal, coral reef, these coastal pelagic zones, or offshore areas. Let's look at the catch. Out of all the folks looking at what happens to their catch after they land it, post-landings disposition of the catch, the majority of the catch is either kept or given away for household consumption. Less than 12% of the catch is sold. So really what that tells us is the majority of fishing in Maunalua Bay is non-commercial. And by that I mean subsistence or consumptive fishing, recreational or cultural fishing. These things are different types of activities. They're different things, but they're hard to disaggregate because these things can all happen on one fishing trip. But the take-home message is that these non-commercial fishing activities are the most prevalent ones in the bay. There is some part-time commercial fishing. We define part-time as those fishers reporting 5% or greater income from fishing or having sold consistently to a commercial vendor or business. A lot of this is what we call offset fishing, where people are selling a portion of their catch to offset costs associated with fishing, things like fuel and ice, food and such that you have to offset costs for. But among folks that are selling catch, which is a small percentage of the entire sample, only 16 out of 58, people are selling to the auction, to restaurants and local markets. So that's kind of where the sold catch is going. The last thing we want to reiterate with this is that catch is distributed throughout the community, that when people consume the catch or give it away, generally the catch is going through these kinship networks, people that are related, family and friends and longtime community members. And that's an important aspect of the fishery, because exchanging or giving fish is a socio-cultural practice that has a long history here in Hawaii. We asked fishers to rank the condition of the bay on a scale from 5 to 1 stars. 5 stars being healthy, abundant, and diverse, and 1 star being severely degraded. And what we see is among experienced fishermen with over 45 years of fishing in the bay, they observed a 60% decline in terms of how they rank the condition of the bay, from around 4.5 stars to below 2 stars. And that's a significant finding, because it tells us that the most experienced fishers have really seen a major decline in the health of the bay. Experienced fishers also seem to perceive more decline than less experienced fishers. And what that tells us is that what's called the shifting baseline syndrome seems to be occurring here, where that fishers who have a longer history in the bay have seen abundances that are perhaps higher than less experienced fishers, so they have actually observed a bigger decline in the health of the bay. We also asked fishers to just qualitatively describe declines in the environment, the drivers of those declines, and the current threats to the bay. What we see is that there are major declines in marine resources, habitat quality, and increases in threats throughout the bay through time. One of the major declines that people described were declines in specific species, including coastal pelagics that were previously much more abundant in the bay. Those are things like akule and opelu. But also reef fish. People really described declines in reef fish through time, that they were much more abundant, that fish were bigger, and that the communities were more diverse. Also, these habitat builders, the important habitat builders of reef-building corals and endemic limu species, less abundant than they were previously. What are the drivers of environmental change? According to the fishing community, it's a diverse set of things. Increased siltation and sedimentation was described by nearly all the fishing community in terms of its increase through time, as well as other land-based pollutants. Ocean users and fishers really identified overfishing as a major threat to the bay. So that was something that the fishing community actually identified and touched on a lot, but also invasive species. The common threats currently to the bay, a lot of the same things that are occurring over time: overdevelopment, land-based pollution, irresponsible or egregious or incorrect fishing practices, and the increase of those practices through time, but also increases in numbers of people and invasive species as well. We also asked fishers to describe changes in their catch. We asked them to give us an average of their catch when they first started fishing, size of the catch, both in terms of size of fish, but as well as the weight of the catch, the pounds caught. And what we see is that if we look at it by the 6 most commonly described species for reef areas, now this is focusing on the reef zones and not pelagic zones, is we see major declines. The red bars are what people caught in terms of the amount of the catch when they first started actively fishing in the bay, and the blue are what they're catching currently. And what we see are major declines. Uhu and goatfish by far the biggest, around 75% decline in the catch. Crustaceans and taco or he'e, 50 to 60% declines, and oio and olua, 30 to 40% declines. So major declines is the story in terms of the catch by species. If we do this by gear type, we get a very similar trend in that we see major declines in terms of the percent decrease in catch. Throw net, poles, primarily these are poles for shore fishing, and then spears. We see major declines from 13 to 62% in the catch over time. And so what this tells us in a nutshell is that catch declines are prevalent, that the fishing community was previously catching much more fish when they first started fishing in the bay versus current. We also asked the fishing community about their perceptions on enforcement in the bay. The vast majority of folks, 91%, know and understand the rules for fishing in the bay, and more than half say that the rules and regulations are easy to understand. In contrast, when we asked folks whether the current rules are sufficiently enforced, the vast majority, 77%, said they weren't currently enforced in the bay. So we get a strong sense that the rules and regulations aren't sufficiently enforced. People hardly ever see enforcement personnel. 81% of the folks that we interviewed agree that they hardly ever see enforcement personnel. So this tells us that yes, their rules are easy to understand, but that they're really not being actively enforced in the bay. We asked folks if they knew people who had been cited for illegal fishing. 68% hadn't known people who were cited. And then about half the people said they disagree that they've even heard of people who have been cited for fishing. So what this tells us just corroborates the previous data, which is that not only do people view enforcement as being particularly lax in the bay, but they don't even know or have heard of folks who have been illegal fishing in high numbers. So we just don't see that enforcement being that strong in the bay. We asked people if the current rules and regulations were enforced, would they be sufficient to protect marine resources? They're split on that. About half the folks said they disagree that the rules alone would be sufficient. About 42% agree that they would. So there's a split there. But the vast majority of people disagree that if management were to continue, that the bay would be abundant and diverse for their grandchildren. So there's a strong indication on folks that management does need to change. We asked folks what they did when they saw illegal fishing activities occurring in the bay. The vast majority of folks called doe care. 25 out of 58 people who actually witnessed things called the state. Many people who said this said that they often didn't show up in time or quick enough to actually catch people. So a lot of people actually documented illegal activity or confronted violators themselves. So we see that among the fishing community, there are actions that the fishing community is taking to self-enforce or self-police the bay. That's important if management activities are to consider different types of enforcement. We also asked the fishing community about their levels of support for different management measures. Nearly 85% of folks who we interviewed would participate in a community-based management program. So that indicates a high level of capacity and willingness to engage in a management program among the fishing community. That's really important, I think. We asked folks if they would support a harvest ban on certain species. About 65% would. 75% would support a ban on certain types of gear. Again, high levels of agreement that some types of different management strategies, including bans on species or gears, might be supported by the fishing community. But most of the fishing community would not support closing Mauna Lua Bay totally to fishing. This isn't surprising. Most fishers don't want to be cut off from their resource. But about half would support closing the bay for a limited amount of years, 3 to 5 years, and then restocking with endemic species and reopening. So that's got about half support among the folks we interviewed. One of the major findings is about 71% of folks we interviewed would support a protected area in the bay for conservation or education purposes. So the fishing community would protect an area of the bay and place it off limits, but it should be said that most folks, when they respond that way, want to be consulted and involved in that process. So support alone for these harvest bans or a marine protected area would be insufficient. The fishing community would need to be consulted as part of this, but they do indicate a high level of support for these types of things. And then nearly all the folks we interviewed would support more effective enforcement, which isn't surprising. That kind of holds with some of the previous data we presented. So just to sum things up, the fishing community has observed and documented major changes in the marine environment. Catch declines have been pronounced. Some species have declined by 75%. Some gear types, so we've seen catch decline by 60% or more. So there's a strong indication that the health of the bay has declined among all the folks that we interviewed. Drivers of these changes are diverse. Among these main threats that currently exist for the bay, none of these are unsolvable. Incorrect and irresponsible fishing practices, land-based pollution and invasive species and overdevelopment, all these things can be addressed. The fishing community is a great resource to engage in these things. And they had specific management recommendations and support for different types of management interventions. All fishers believe that better enforcement is needed in the bay. Fishers also demonstrated a high level of support for species and gear bans as well as a protected area, but they would need to be consulted and involved in that process. Nonetheless, that shows a high level of support for these different types of management measures that could be considered. In conclusion, it remains difficult to categorize fishing activities in terms of whether they're subsistence, recreation, or cultural. We call these non-commercial activities. They're by far the most prevalent types of fishing activities that are going on in the bay. There is some commercial part-time fishing that's occurring in the bay, but it's less part of the fishery than consumptive and other types of non-commercial fishing activities. The catch distribution and disposition is an important part of these local fisheries, fresh seafood, locally caught seafood that's coming into the community via these fishers. And the fishing community really wants to be engaged. They're concerned about the future. The knowledge that these folks have is incredible, and they have a long history in the bay, and they have tremendous traditional ecological knowledge that represents a great resource to the community, and they demonstrate a high capacity of willingness to be involved in a community-based program. And lastly, the types of data we presented here that we've gathered in this effort, in this community-led and participatory research, can really provide critical information for a community-based management program. So we think this is a valuable type of information, and really the fishing community represents a significant resource. So with that, I'll close, and mahalo for your time. Thank you.